I'm Astridy Neimanis, and this talk is called The Sea and the Breathing. I'm going to begin by reading the abstract for the talk so that you have a sense of where it's going. In this talk, I read feminist Black studies scholar Christina Sharp's understanding of the weather, alongside lesbian feminist poet Adrienne Rich's 1971 poem, Diving into the Wreck. In doing so, I offer up the idea of weather underwater. The weather underwater is complex. First, it asks us to connect climate change and ocean deoxygenation to what Christina Sharp calls a pervasive anti-Blackness. A difficulty breathing experienced by Black people and the ocean remind us that climate change is connected to social justice politics in ways that are not always obvious. Secondly, the weather underwater gives us a way to reread Adrienne Rich in the contemporary moment. We discover that the gender politics of her poem compellingly open to an eco-poetics concerned with more than human life in the wreck of Anthropocene seas. We also discover, though, that the anti-Blackness that Sharp teaches us about is also part of this wreck, but Rich's diver doesn't notice it. So I conclude with two related calls. First, for feminism to pay better attention to the haunters of racial social justice as part of any feminist environmental politics or poetics. But second, to refuse analogy or simple similarity between different kinds of injustice. Even as this paper suggests important connections between gendered, racialized, and environmental violences, these are not all the same. We must also attend to their differences and specificities. So let's begin. Part 1 is called The Weather. As an embodied experience in agentic force, weather moves, scars, imprints. Our armpits dampen in response to the heat. Our jaws and tongues stiffen in the biting cold. Like hail-damaged rooftops and sun-bleached laundry, our bodies bear the impressions of the weather world. We could say that weather is the external condition that structures one's quotidian existence. This existence is felt in and as our bodies. But is weather only a meteorological phenomenon? What else swirls in and as the weather world to mark us or to structure our everyday lives? Black study and feminist scholar Christina Sharp suggests that weather is anti-Blackness. Black people must endure the total climate that is anti-Blackness. She writes, quote, "In what I am calling the weather, anti-Blackness is as pervasive as climate." Sharp's chapter, The Weather, from her 2016 book In the Wake, specifically references the Middle Passage and Black slavery in the US, as well as its contemporary manifestations, such as Black deaths in custody and police killings of Black and other racialized people. But her point is that this climate cannot be reduced to an event or a set of events. Sharp's quarry is instead, quote, "the totality of the environments in which we struggle, the machines in which we live, what I am calling the weather." Weather, therefore, is context and milieu, both pervasive and often unnoticed. There may be a temptation to read Sharp's work as metaphor or analogy, whereby anti-Blackness is like bad weather. Yet definitively separating social and cultural conditions from environmental ones is impossible. The milieus with which our bodies contend are material, comprising particles, gases, forces, pressures, contaminants, and other matters. Meteorological conditions are but one manifestation of these external structuring conditions. So when Sharp asserts that the weather of anti-Blackness manifests as, quote, "archives of breathlessness," she implicates matters that are discursive, structural, material, and environmental. Sharp points out that breathlessness as weather has always accompanied Black life, from Frantz Fanon's understanding of the connection between revolt and an inability to breathe, to Eric Garner's final words on a New York sidewalk, "I can't breathe." This critical understanding of weather and breath connects to other scholars' discussions of phenomena such as settler atmospherics or a socio-atmospherics of power. Here, in the works of people like Tim Choi and Jerry Z, racism and colonialism are understood not only as discursive constructs, but as material phenomena that imprint on bodies, like all weather. Anti-Blackness as the total climate and other socio-atmospherics of power are made by molecular mixes in matters that enter mouths, lungs, and blood. But they are also made by human bodies that channel power and violence into the air, and which also can take this air away. The weather is neither incidental nor accidental. It is an intra-active, natural cultural phenomenon. Part 2 is called The Breathless Sea. Yet even in our different experiences thereof, the weather imaginary for most humans likely begins at ground level and extends some meters upward. Weather is what and how we live in ways that profoundly make up who counts as one's we. But also it is where we live. In other words, for terrestrial land-loving mammals such as ourselves, flightless, finless, and mostly bipedal, oxygen-breathing, weather tends to be constrained in a rather narrow zone of inhabitability. Weather seems to be primarily in the air we breathe. But what happens if we go deeper? After all, Sharp's book, In the Wake, is also a book about the sea. It examines the maritime crossings of the Middle Passage, the hold of those slave ships, the bodies of slaves discarded into the sea, refugee crossings and forensic oceanographic evidence of, again, a sea asked to hold onto violence and death. Considering Sharp's attention to the sea as a different kind of milieu, we might ask, in what ways is the ocean also an archive of breathlessness? Does weather-making and its socio-atmospherics of power extend beyond our immediate habitat and sink into the sea? From a more than human perspective, the answer to this question is clear. Even as terrestrial weathers heat up, they are spared even more intense effects of rising temperatures because of the sea's absorptive capacity. The watery world is a convenient resting place for all of that heat, which means that oceans are getting warmer. But rising ocean temperatures mean that the sea is also slowly suffocating. While in the last 50 years, overall oxygen levels in the world's oceans have dropped by at least 2%, in coastal zones, hypoxic conditions have increased far more dramatically. Dead zones in the ocean where oxygen is almost totally depleted has quadrupled since the 1950s. Even small changes in sea temperatures dramatically affect the behavior, reproductive patterns, and movements of ocean creatures, which affects ocean food webs and oxygen levels in turn. For phytoplankton, hotter water temperatures mean moving to different habitats, becoming smaller, which affects their ability to soak up the carbon we are pumping out. Simply put, all of our greenhouse gas-stoked and fossil-fueled desires are making the sea breathless. We are weather makers, even in the places that our bodies do not and cannot belong. This might be ironic if it were not so devastating. Even as we may still imagine the oceans as an unfathomable elsewhere, the convenient dump for out-of-sight and out-of-mind discards, our weather-making returns to us in multiple ways. Ocean photosynthesizers gift to humans every second breath we take, meaning that human air breathers such as ourselves will also be profoundly affected by the suffocation of the seas. We are making the weather underwater and in turn deoxygenating ourselves. Part 3, the weather underwater. The breathless sea reminds us then that care and justice must gather up all bodies, not only human ones, but more than human aquatic life as well. Climate justice is radically extended to a multi-species justice of the deep, where the life of ocean waters is itself at stake. But must we not also ask, what is lost when the words, "I can't breathe," slip, almost unnoticed, off of the body of Eric Garner or George Floyd, to be washed into the ocean, now eddying around the bodies of phytoplankton, brachyrian crab, or bivalve mollusk? Grappling with the weather underwater cannot be the simple inflation of categories, such as weather or climate or justice. We must remain alert to how differences morph, connect, and come to matter differently. For in the wake and sinking to the seafloor, what we will discover are not only Spam cans and car tires, chemical traces and carbon takeovers, but also the afterlife of the Middle Passage, the undersea of anti-blackness and white supremacy. Sharp points out that Black slaves who did not complete the crossing, whose bodies, deemed excessive, ill, unprofitable, were thrown overboard into the Atlantic, but are still present. Quote, "Because organisms eating organisms is the cycling of nutrients through the ocean, the atoms of those people who were thrown overboard are out there in the ocean even today." End quote. In and as the bodies of other benthic beings, these bodies are still in the wake. Sharp does not explicitly discuss this transubstantiating undersea afterlife as weather, but her work invites us to consider the relation of these dissolutions to the anthropogenic suffocation of the sea. For example, she notes that, quote, "The amount of time it takes for a substance to enter the ocean and then leave the ocean is called residence time, and the sodium content in human blood suggests it could have a residence time of 260 million years. She continues, "What happens to the energy that is produced in the waters? It continues cycling like atoms in residence time. We, Black people, exist in the residence time of the wake," writes Sharp. Quoting Toni Morrison's Beloved, Sharp points out that this is a time, quote, "in which everything is now. It is all now." With these concerns in mind, we will now enter the sea again, but this time diving into the wreck. What will we find, and what will we notice? Part 4, Diving into the Wreck. In her 1972 poem, Diving into the Wreck, white U.S. lesbian feminist poet Adrienne Rich describes a speculative scene of underwater disaster. "I came to explore the wreck," writes the poem's narrator, after they slip off the edge of a sun-drenched schooner. "The diver's earthly body and its modes of inhabiting the world become redundant as the turquoise waters slowly turn dark. First the air is blue, and then it is bluer, and then green, and then black. I am blacking out," she writes. The narrator loses a terrestrially bound consciousness. The diver lacks the guidance they need to survey this new world. Unlike oceanographer Jacques Cousteau with his assiduous team, this diver notes that they are, quote, "here alone." As they descend, "There is no one to tell me when the ocean will begin. I have to learn alone to turn my body without force in the deep element." The diver finally reaches the sunken wreck. Illuminated with the beam of their torch, they discover, quote, "the drowned face, the half-destroyed instruments that once held to a course, and the evidence of damage between the ribs of disaster." What kind of allegory is intended here? What does Rich's diver go in search of, and what do they discover? Commentary on Rich's poem mostly refers to a deformed social order, and in particular, the wreck of gendered systems of power. Metaphorically evoking, quote, the submerged history of patriarchal oppression and its drowned victims, as one commentator writes, the wreck is said to index the wreck of obsolete myths, particularly myths about men and women. That was Margaret Atwood in a 1973 review of the poem. Yet reading the poem in our contemporary moment, where climate emergency itself is the weather we inhabit, the poem's setting in the undersea implores a contemporary reader to perceive the wreck in and as the literal sea as well. After all, as Black femme scholar Omaseki Natasha Tinsley's queer reading of the Black Atlantic insists, quote, the point is never that we should strip theory of watery metaphors, but that we should return to the materiality of water to make its metaphors mean more complexly. The question that I want to turn to then in the second half of this talk is, how can we read Rich's poem today? Well, it may be, as I argue below, that it offers us an interesting perspective on the weather underwater when it comes to the health of a multi-species ocean. It also connects this to the gendered order of the Anthropocene. But moreover, I want to know, how can it respond to Sharp's idea of total weather, the anti-blackness where archive persists below the waves as residence time? So let's begin by further unpacking the poem as a kind of Anthropocene allegory about climate-changing seas. We discover that even if we bring to Rich's work an anachronistic attention to the materiality of the sea, such focus is supported rather than contradicted by Rich's invocation of myth and the allegorical mode in which the poem is written. After all, as we've already mentioned in relation to the breathless sea, the ocean's mythical, endless capacity to dissolve our dumped desires into her fathomless bosom is what has in part precipitated the current ecological crises. The material imaginary of the eternal sea has resulted in a pervasive Western cultural imaginary that figures the oceans as vast, unknown, and uninhabitable by us. As a medium that we humans can only dwell in temporarily, deep waters materialize otherness and unknowability as depths beyond our comprehension. Through this long-standing storying of the sea, then, it becomes imaginatively distanced from our own terrestrial habitats. The imaginary of the sea as this other place also then connects to mythologies of the sea as beyond time. Cultural theorist Janine McLeod summarizes the argument of Gaston Bachelard, noting that, quote, it may be impossible to describe the past without drawing on images of deep water. The sea stretches endlessly into the past without definite origin, a past swimming backwards beyond our grasp. These timeless marine depths thus lead us to imagine that we can cast off our dumped desires to a time that is no longer now. Plastic polymers, fishing nets, nitrogen, phosphorus, radioactive isotopes, seismic blasts, carbon, flip-flops, rubber ducks, unexploded bombs, cigarette filters, medical waste, crude oil, palm oil, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, lead, flame retardants, pirates' booty, herbicides, pesticides, animal fat, antidepressants, fidget spinners. All of this is benignly consigned to an ocean, not only out of sight, but out of our time. Instructed by this mythic deep temporality of the sea, we are led to believe that we can relinquish what we no longer want, that our spent desires can be ferried away to a far away and a long ago, and that damage will never arrive. Archive without effect. When the diver in Adrienne Rich's poem journeys to the benthos, they seek, quote, the wreck and not the story of the wreck, the thing itself and not the myth. Might the myth then also be the idea that the sea itself is somehow immune to our material trespass? All of those anthropogenic wants are hardly gone, the diver discovers. They are instead lying, quote, obscurely inside barrels, half wedged and left to rot. The burden of their toxicity is belied by the mermaid or the merman. The poem insists on this ambivalence, quote, whose breasts still bear the stress of that drowned cargo. Out of sight and out of time, the deep has become the increasingly banal sink for our capitalist consumerist desires, held in the form of pollution, rising sea temperatures, and acidification. Increasingly breathless, the oceanic milieu is also an archive of ecological wreckage. The irony is this mythic imaginary is precisely the sea's capacity to retain our castaways into a deep future that makes the ocean vulnerable, and that makes us, dependent on her ability to breathe, vulnerable too. In all of these ways, we might read Rich's poem as a corroborating poetics, at least in part, for Sharp's Weather Underwater. For there is indeed a wreck in and as the ocean, wrought by our human hand. Such a reading does not annul an earlier one that suggests that this poem is about gender. Indeed, the connection between, quote, a submerged history of patriarchal oppression and the ecological wreck of the sea is what Rich, perhaps unwittingly, invites us to consider. As many environmental feminist thinkers have noted, the oppression of non-human natures and women is connected, even if the manifestation of this connection shifts across contexts. As Val Plumwood argued decades ago, the inferiorization of human qualities and aspects of life associated with necessity, nature, and women continues to operate to the disadvantage of women, nature, and the quality of human life. That's a 1993 quote from Plumwood. Or, in the words of feminist environmental theorist Sherilyn McGregor, quote, it is impossible fully to understand the ecologically destructive consequences of human development without understanding their gendered character. So Rich's poem opens to an exploration of how these relations between gender and environment also tumble into the sea. For the wreck is not only allegory for a troubled gendered social order, but a way to understand social stresses as linked to the material health of the ocean. For instance, if we turn back to that mermaid or merman whose, quote, breasts still bear the stress of the wrecked cargo, we might consider how toxic incursions are unevenly distributed through planetary waters to other bodies in gendered ways. These include the ways in which breast milk of Indigenous women is disproportionately contaminated by PCBs, either because their homes are situated alongside toxic industries, or because contaminants biomagnify up through the marine food chain to be concentrated in the milk of new mothers who feed on marine meat. We might consider fetuses bathed in amniotic fluid that register high levels of industrial contaminants, or the buildup of environmental toxicants in that uniquely gendered and temporal organ, the placenta. We might also consider how the contamination of waterways with anthropogenic toxicants intervenes in the sex morphologies and reproductive capacities of humans and more than humans that dwell in water and on their shores. So indeed, while the diver who claims, quote, I am she, I am he, could be reclaimed through an affirmative transgender politics, which I would like, It is also difficult not to read these changes alongside aquatic environmental changes that result in increasingly sex-skewed birth rates in some communities and growing incidence of changing sex characteristics in fish and amphibians. So, in other words, there are connections between gender, sex, morphology, bodies, and polluted waters in ways that are both complex and nuanced. Deploying Plumwood's 1993 master model analysis, we see that such impacts cannot be viewed as incidental to female or feminized bodies. Rather, they reveal the ways in which the domination of nature and the contamination of water is sustained by roaring currents of patriarchal capitalism. To return to the structure of analysis offered to us by Christina Sharp, then, we come to understand the weather underwater as also tangled up with misogyny, gender normativity, and patriarchal domination. Part 5, the tentative haunters. But how does this weather, where gendered power meets the archive of rotting desires at the bottom of the sea, articulate with Christina Sharp's critical insights into weather as anti-Blackness? To invoke the work of Sharp demands remaining attentive to that work's context and to Sharp's commitment to Black lives and life worlds that the work holds at its own wet heart. On one reading, we might say it doesn't. Despite articulations with environmental justice concerns, there's not a lot in Rich's poem about Blackness and little that reverberates with the deeply intersectional feminist environmental humanities. In fact, we could even parse Rich's diver as an avatar of white feminism, seeing her own gender oppression and nothing else. So the poem might bring together a damaged gender order with a breathless, polluted sea, but nothing else. What else, we wonder, is curving its assertion between the ribs of disaster, as Rich writes? What else is there that the white feminist diver, or perhaps a certain reader of the poem, does not easily notice? Another way to think through this question is to be attentive to the interstices of the poem, to its strange temporalities, its unanticipated meetings, its opening to a different mode of embodied becoming. In the first place, although the diver explains their trepidation at, quote, having to do this here alone, upon reaching the wreck at the Benthos, they also marvel at what they find, slightly distracted, quote, by those many who have always lived here. Put otherwise, perhaps the narrator's courageous descent is interrupted by their blunt realization that many before have already undertaken this journey by necessity, violence, or choice. We read, for example, that as the diver descends, they become distracted by, quote, the tentative haunters that move between the ribs of disaster. As readers, we might become curious. Who or what are those many that the diver discovers amidst the wreck? Those others that contradict the diver's own assertion that they are, quote, having to do this alone. On one reading, the salt and sway of crenellated fans between the reefs may simply suggest scenes of siphonophores, mollusks, sessile anemones, in other words, a coffee table picture book image of the flourishing multi-species life of the sea. Those many might just be the marine world that comprises the diver's other place or their otherwise. But that reading would be problematic. First, if we understand Rich's wreck to be a kind of sixth extinction or Anthropocene parable, then we need to refuse an imaginary of undersea ecologies as mysterious or as an untouched elsewhere for those of us who are brave enough or privileged enough to escape there. We've already established that the sea is not immune to anthropogenic weathers. The idea that the ocean would still represent a place of otherworldly refuge, of pure nature, is precisely the myth that an environmental humanities reading of the poem seeks to interrupt. Those tentative haunters, as a vibrancy of marine life, we know are already changing in the breathless Anthropocene seas. But secondly, in thinking about the various wreckages of the human, we must resist the impulse to approach a critique of the anthropos by leaping straight to the question of the animal or the vegetal or the fungal or the microbial. As Black feminist philosopher Zakiya Jackson cautions us, quote, "The appeal to move beyond the human may actually reintroduce the Eurocentric transcendentalism this movement purports to disrupt, particularly with regard to the historical and ongoing disruptive ordering of race." This move to the non-human, Jackson argues, is concomitantly an attempt to move beyond race. In other words, the question of the animal and the non-human is not only a way for white scholarship to address its anthropocentrism, but it could also be a way for us to do so without having to confront our racist foundations. So here, to move straight to understanding those tentative haunters in Rich's poem as otherworldly marine creatures might also be a way of bypassing the question of race and its insistent troubling of the human. After all, a consideration of more than human sea life is more palatable and less threatening to whiteness than conceding the total climate of anti-Blackness that Sharp teaches us about. If we want to consider the non-human, should we not learn in the first instance from, quote, "the potentially transformative expressions of humanity that are cast out of the world and thus rendered inhuman," as Jackson describes in relation to race? How then might the disavowal that Jackson calls out be instead confronted and accounted for in Rich's poem? Recalling again the double gender of Rich's diver, I am she, I am he, we might take our first clue from the work of Black feminist Hortense Spillers, who argues that transatlantic slavery, conversely, entailed the ungendering of the Africans whose bodies the Middle Passage's brutality turned into flesh, what Spillers calls that 0 degree of social conceptualization. This ejected Black women from female subjecthood, she writes. These bodies turned flesh were literally suspended in the oceanic, if, following Freud, we also understand this as, quote, undifferentiated identity. Here I'm drawing from Spillers. So prompted by Spillers' arguments, we might articulate this ungendered and seared, divided, ripped apart flesh, in her words, with Sharp's invocation of, quote, the atoms of those people who were thrown overboard, who are out there in the ocean even today. In other words, Black slaves who have morphed to persist as residue in the residence time of the sea. Might this residue also be what haunts the wreck that Rich's diver discovers? So, reading Sharp alongside Rich, we are thus called to consider that in this descent, the diver is not only witnessing and perhaps celebrating the wreck of a certain gendered social order, nor only are they witnessing the breathless, wrecked sea. They are also being made to confront the weather of anti-Blackness that is still held by the ocean, which wrecked gendered orders in another way altogether, as Spillers reminds us. Reading Sharp alongside Rich, we come to see that these things are not unconnected. Here, In the wreck and in the currents of residence time, we begin to carefully unpick how the weather of anti-Blackness is always tethered to the collapse of human planetary relations. Yet here, among these tentative haunters, and in the curved rib of disaster, we must also refuse the equivalence of violence. Dinoflagellates or anemones or seashells and mollusks are not like a black body. Gender oppression is not like slavery or contemporary anti-Blackness. Analogies and equivalences are their own kind of violence, perpetuating the invisibility and pervasiveness of weather as anti-Blackness. So instead of simply equating these violences, we must connect these weather systems in their common alibis of force and power, while remaining attentive to scales of mattering whose objective measures of analogy and quantitative comparison have also been dissolved in the strange material admixtures of the sea. In other words, following generations of vibrant feminist and anti-racist scholarship, violence in the oceans cannot be a question of add gender and stir, nor add race and stir. Parsing the complex ways in which racism, misogyny, and environmental violences are connected, while also attending to their differences, reinforcements, contradictions, absences, silences, hauntings, and alibis, will demand no less than articulating a new theory of power, one that is fit for purpose for the strange world after the end of the world that we may now be inhabiting. Thank you.